So we'll gavel in work session? Work session of the Anchorage Assembly. Mr. Trainee, members in attendance. Dick Trainee is right. Are we started? Yes, we are started. Who are you?
Susie LaFrance.
Yes, you are.
Austin Davidson.
Eric Croft.
Becky Pearson, Municipal Attorney.
Christopher Constant.
And we're here on two different work sessions. This one on long-term vacant properties and persistent nuisance properties. We are trying to take maximum advantage of Ms. Wynn Pearson's time and expertise while we have her. We don't know when we are going to lose her for a period of time. And she's the lead and expert on this. So, Ms. Wynn Pearson, tell us what we're doing here.
Certainly. Is there a way for us to change the lights a little so we can see this a little better? Okay, so I'm here to talk today about AO 2019-9, which is in front of you. Has a somewhat lengthy title detailing the very specific things that it does. The overarching thing that it does is it creates new nuisance property abatement tools. By way of background, I think we all are aware that nuisance properties are a problem across the municipality. I know I've talked to, I think, most of you individually about problem properties in each of your districts. We end up with properties that are sometimes inhabited, sometimes not inhabited, where there are persistent nuisances in the form of all different forms. Storage of materials that are attracting other types of nuisances, burned out homes that are attracting vagrancy, drug use, crime, etc. And we've been looking for tools to address this problem across the municipality and try and make some substantial progress in this area. In 2018, you all know you all appropriated an additional $200,000 specifically to deal with nuisance properties. And so what we did with that is the administration put together a working group with representatives from legal department, the real estate department, code enforcement, and community economic development to try and bring all of the tools that we have to the table to make some progress in this area and wisely spend that money to make the maximum impact that we could.
And we've been joined by Mr. Dunbar. Go.
Excellent. The approach to each of these properties is different. We have several different tools. I've talked about this, I believe, with many of you before as well. We have some tools based on excess police calls, some tools based on the presence of nuisances that violate Title 15, some tools based on tax foreclosure in the event that taxes are delinquent on properties, which often is the case as well. So we tried to bring all these different groups together to bring all those different bodies of knowledge, different approaches together. What we did, we created a team approach that we're planning to continue into the future that involves, again, all these departments collaborating. We essentially created a top 10 problem properties list based on the properties about which we had sort of the most long-term consistent complaints and concerns where we had reached a real critical point of needing to intervene. And then we also went through a process which resulted in this ordinance, which is we talked about what are the code loopholes and challenges that make enforcement challenging, that stand in the way of taking steps that we all know need to be taken, and what could we propose to be able to address those challenges. So what have we been doing over the past year? We've been all over the community. This is, I think, an Airport Heights property, Bear Valley property, I think this is an East Anchorage property, Chugiak property. There's been a number of substantial cleanups. So this year has been a year that's been a lot about figuring out, targeting properties that really need to be cleaned up, figuring out what hook we have to clean them up or to compel the owner to clean up those properties and make a difference in those top 10 worst offender kind of properties we have across the community. We also, we identified what are our persistent enforcement problems, what are the things that come up most often as concerns about the action that we're taking or not taking. Number one, I'd say, is why haven't you taken action yet? Why are you not, this has been a problem for a month, a year, 20 years, why have you not come and bulldozed the property or cleaned it up or done something more proactive? Second, how are we going to pay for it? These are related concerns. I think that why have we not taken action sometimes hangs specifically together with not having the money to do it. It's not a cheap process to haul away tons of junk from a property, or even a ton of junk from property. So that's a consistent problem. And then we have this one more minor, more technical problem, but which rears its head consistently for us, is lack of accountability during the foreclosure process. And there's actually an ADN article specifically about this in the fall. The issue there being that as soon as foreclosure proceedings are started, generally the underlying property owner essentially realizes there's no more economic incentive to comply with code provisions, stops being accountable or responding to any efforts to have the property brought into compliance, and then the bank is not technically yet an owner, so they are not yet technically legally liable to comply with the code, and they're like often out of state. We call people and get the runaround and never get anybody on the phone who has any kind of accountability, and generally can't find anyone who will take responsibility for the property, and then foreclosure proceedings can take in excess of a year or 2 years to come to fruition. So we have this very long period where a property sits in limbo, no one's accountable, and unless the municipality is essentially willing to board and babysit the property, which we don't really have the resources to do, then we end up with this gap in time where our property can really become a problem issue.
So we've been joined by Mr. Rivera. So for a while you weren't getting much compliance, and then you hit this foreclosure period where you're essentially getting none.
Yeah, and you think about like weighing the incentives. No one then has any incentive. Oftentimes by the time it gets to this point, the owner has lost. Has feels like they don't want to take any action anyway. But once you hit to the foreclosure process, there's really no economic incentive for an owner to do anything.
Mr. Dunmore.
I'm probably stepping on your point and jumping ahead of the presentation, but could we fine them then? Can the fines travel with the land?
Well, that is what we are going to, we proposed a solution to this issue. The ordinance in front of you, I'm setting up what are the problems we've identified, and I'm about to offer you solutions in this ordinance for these specific 3 problems. So basically, next slide, our proposed solutions, which you'll see in 2019-9, are 3 things. First is holding banks accountable, and what we propose is a foreclosure registry, and then a corresponding expansion of accountability for code compliance. And I'll tell you more details about what those 2 things look like in just a second. The second is creating a dedicated financial resource. So we do have the power to create dedicated funds under Title VI, where money goes into the fund and doesn't get swept out if it's not used at the end of the year, can stay in there, comes from a few designated sources, and then is tagged specifically for this work, so it can't be spent on moved around to other areas of the budget on a whim, and is instead dedicated to making sure that we have a financial resource for this type of work on an ongoing basis. And our vision is to make this self-replenishing with the proceeds from, so if we foreclose on a nuisance property, we clean it, we sell it, we make some kind of profit, the proceeds go into this fund, and then they are turned around to use for the next nuisance property to do cleanup, to help with resale.
Becky?
Yeah.
That raises a question. So, currently, the land bank and Robin's department manages real estate transactions. Their operating budget comes from the revenues of their sales. Mm-hmm. So if we tap the revenues from the sales to move into another function, what happens to Robin's department and the Heritage Land Bank? How do we keep them whole?
Well, the idea here is that this is actually a new revenue source, because we have not, until this year when we started to take a more concerted action in this area, we've not foreclosed on properties for nuisance reasons. We've had the power to, but Robin is dealing with a body of tax foreclosures that happen every year. So the vision is that this would not be standard tax foreclosures. This would be properties that were identified as nuisance properties, foreclosed upon for nuisance property related reasons. And it wouldn't be a huge body of them, but as we've seen this year, I mean, $200,000 in the grand scheme of the municipal budget is not a lot of money, and it makes a lot of difference. And so, if we
department is a huge hit.
Certainly, but we're looking at this as a new revenue source. So it wouldn't
still be doing the work.
She'll still be doing she'll still be getting her proceeds from her foreclosed properties. We're looking at foreclosing on more properties now.
Will she be processing the foreclosures under this title? Right? Will she still be doing the work and not be having the revenues to pay for the people to do the work? That's a wrinkle. We don't have to solve that today, but that's the question that comes to
I think she will do some of the work. Foreclosure is actually handled by the Department of Law.
Okay.
Oh, actually, maybe Chris can answer that question.
Yeah,
More.
so Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development. So in cases like this, real estate handles the foreclosures. Real estate takes a cut. So real estate is the real estate agent for the municipality. And so when we work on behalf of other departments or enterprises, we're always making sure that we get paid.
Right.
Now, one thing I wanted to clear up, the inventory of real estate or HLV property should be thought of as separately from the real estate function. It is a separate part of the municipality. It handles its land and its assets, much different. Robin's function as the real estate department's function is primarily to serve as a real estate agent, and that's the role that they will play in this, and it's entirely separate from HLV.
Excellent question. So you're saying, both of you, if I got it right, that she has her foreclosure portfolio, and we're adding a nuisance portfolio, and he left, but she would get a percentage or a payment for
That's the question.
doing that.
Would she?
Yes. I mean,
Yeah, and that's what Chris is saying. And we also, I mean, there are other parties that are involved. Like, again, the actual foreclosure is handled by the Department of Law, and
Right.
we will continue. We'll add this to our list of things that we foreclose on, and move
And there's
this forward
intergovernmental transfers to pay
that
you
deal
and
with
her.
those things. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Excellent question. We were also joined by Mr. Peterson. I have Mr. Weddleton and Mr. Train.
Okay, now I'm confused. 'Cause
Chris, come back.
foreclosures here. You're just talking bank. Someone's not paying their bank.
No, we're talking about we have the power to foreclose, and we do eventually. So when we actually take action against a property, like we're in the middle of this process with the Zabo property up in Bear Valley, when we have a person who's been fined for repeatedly for a year or 10 years for violations of Title 15, we eventually foreclose, and we have the power to foreclose because.
So let's go in order.
we-
Foreclosure we think of as a mortgage, you didn't pay your mortgage. That's
Yeah, so
one
there's
way.
there's
But then-
different types of. So the first piece addresses when someone else is foreclosing, when your bank is foreclosing because you haven't paid your mortgage. How do we hold your bank accountable and you accountable during the process? The second piece is when we foreclose because we have, some of these properties we have $400,000 of outstanding fines levied against the property because we've been fining them for years and they have been
But
doing
just
nothing.
up to now, we've
Yeah.
only been foreclosing for delinquent taxes,
Yes.
principally. So that's the second type of foreclosing. And the third we're adding here is if you accumulate so many fines through code enforcement or whatever, we may foreclose for that reason.
Which we've always had the power to do legally, but which we have not done in the past. We've
Roger
started
that.
moving in that direction with our real problem properties. Third piece of the ordinance is new financial incentives for action. This goes to the how can you not take action more quickly, why is nothing being done piece. We have what we conceived of as a solution to that, or the best solution we can muster under
Oh, I'm sorry,
constitutional
I had
protections.
Mr. Trainee and
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Becky, how much money do we have to appropriate to create this program?
To
Is the
create
money
this-
already out there, or are we going to have a nest egg to start this?
Well, you did appropriate $100,000 this year, and I think our vision is that we would hope to be able to add to that through some activity this year to do some self-replenishing, and then clearly the more money that's in this fund, the more that can be done. So I think it'd be a judgment call for each assembly each year to say, okay, we've got this much money in the fund that's been created through fee payments and through foreclosures. Do we want to add more? Do we see this as a more persistent problem where we want to consistently also appropriate $100,000 to this project? Or do we just want to say you've got $50,000 that you've created through your program, you just use that?
Because as this grows, and they've got money in there, I don't want a future mayor to want to raid on that fund. Because past mayors have looked for possible money and taken it for another project.
And that was our vision in creating a dedicated fund, which clearly could still be taken away by a future mayor and assembly working together because it's in the code. It would have to be repealed. But the
That's
idea
right.
is that
Maybe we'll do
we
it.
tried to concoct it as a dedicated fund provided for in the code so that, and make it narrow enough that the money couldn't be just, we couldn't, a future administration and a future assembly couldn't say, oh, we'll just fudge it and move that money over here to pay this other bill that we want to pay and we're not actually going to keep doing this. The idea being we have this dedicated fund and there has to be an actual action between the administration and the assembly to repeal that provision of code if you don't want to have it remain in place in the future.
One other question, Becky. I've got some homes in my assembly district that they've been trying to get action taken, but the guy goes to court and then the court says, okay, you got 6 more months to come to compliance. Then the next time he does a video on TV showing he had open heart surgery, oh, you need another 6 months for that. Is there a way to speed this process up? Because from some of my constituents, they think it'll never be solved.
And I think the challenge is there is some way, but it will never be as fast as people want it to be, and largely for good reason. Because the flip side of this is that at the end of the day, our end solution is we take a home away from someone who owns their home, and we do not want to do that without adequate procedural protections and adequate protections for people to come into compliance if they're experiencing a challenge in their life. And so I think the challenge you run into is that neighbors often feel very impatient, and for better or for worse, the process before we get to a foreclosure based on nuisance is often many years. You end up in a court proceeding, and you do end up with opportunities for homeowners to say, look, I'm experiencing an illness. I need this much time to address this. Or I just had a spouse who passed who had an issue with hoarding property. I need time to deal with it, and time is given by the court, again, for good reason. So what we've tried to do is, what we're trying to do here with these financial incentives is move us to the point where we go to court more quickly, and then still the court process will provide those protections. But this, if we increase the way in which we impose fees and fines, our vision is that will hopefully compel individuals to take action more quickly who are capable of doing it, and then also bring us to the place as a municipality more quickly where we have enough of an outstanding fee or fine to make it worth it to go to court and try and take a next step more quickly, and then again triggering that process.
All right, Mr. Welton and then Mr. Peterson. And part of the answer is it's an appropriately time-consuming process to take somebody's property away. It should be. But to fine them for violations and then eventually say, you owe me $50,000 or whatever, $10,000, $20,000, we're going to foreclose on your property too, is a sort of another way around to get that. The court will probably keep giving opportunities for a person not to lose their property, but at some point you can say, you haven't paid me the thing you owed me.
Some of our constituents will complain that the problem is by not taking action in this house, it devalues our property for neighbors around them.
Okay, we've been joined by Ms. Wimhoff, Mr. Weddleton, and then Mr. Peterson.
So if we go on the property and we clean it up, it's gone too far, and then when it sells, we get the money back, right? Would that money go back into the fund?
That's a good question. I think the vision is that it should, because what we'll do is we'll attach a lien for that's specifically related to the cleanup costs, and then we should repay that. And we've done that actually. My understanding is we have a property this year that we foreclosed on for tax purposes, but we also attached a lien to that property for cleanup related to Title 15 violations. And so the proceeds of that, when we foreclose and we resell, go to the real estate department, as you've discussed, but there is also a lien for those Title 15 payments that is something that we could move to this dedicated fund once this dedicated fund exists.
Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Constant. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, are we viewing vacant properties, abandoned properties, and nuisance properties as basically all the same, or do we have definitions for each of those?
So we don't view them as the same, because they have common problems, and I'm referring to them all here as nuisance properties, but our code has a couple different provisions that deal with different types of properties differently. And you'll see as we look at the actual ordinance that this addresses sort of both pieces. There's the foreclosure registry piece goes specifically, I guess it goes to any of the properties, but it's related to our abandoned property ordinance. And then we have fees that come in for registry for abandoned properties each year, and that will be directed to the nuisance property fund. So I think what I'm saying, sorry, I'm sort of talking around in a circle here a little bit. I would say there are two categories. We have properties that are nuisances under Title 15. We have properties that are vacant, that are dealt with by our vacant and abandoned properties ordinance. We see this fund as being available to address both properties, and again, often they're intertwined. Like a property will be vacant or abandoned. It will also be, and in violation of our vacant and abandoned properties ordinance, it will also be a place where there are other violations of Title 15 because people have come on the property who aren't the owners and are creating nuisances there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Thanks. And I'm just come back one last time. I'm looking at the ordinance under the revenue section. It's page 2, line 35B. There, proceeds is. My question is then: does proceeds include all of the sum that comes from the sale, or are we counting as proceeds only those revenues that come after the real estate department has gathered their commission and the the law department is charged their IGA. Because I think we might want to clarify that. Otherwise, what we're going to do, if we do get into a stream of these things, is end up having our staff basically priming this fund without being compensated for their time, and then our expenses are going to go up in our real estate department.
Could we just say net proceeds?
I think we could say net. I think our intent was to have it be essentially the money that we gain as the result of the process less our expenses. And so we could call it, I think net proceeds would be a relatively simple change if we wanted to make that more clear.
Thank you.
Mr. Constant made a good point about protecting the real estate agent's fees.
I'm just saying. It's actual work.
Yeah. So I have had on my, and then we'll let you continue.
Oh, do you want me to go back to my summary slide?
So on my great big list of things to do that I didn't get to, making explicit the power of the muni when there has been an abandoned or nuisance property, I think it'd have to be either vacant or abandoned. The explicit authority to secure it, to evict people who have no right to be there, to maybe fence it. So secure, protect, and evict. Is that needed? That is, do we already have that authority? And to have the costs of doing that add to our so we say it's sitting there, somebody's squatting on it, nobody's responding. I go in, I kick them out, I put a fence up, I board it up. And then that cost me $5,000 for code enforcement to do it. That adds on the thing.
Yeah, I'll let Rich and Jack add to me this if I'm off base with so I would say, and you and I have talked about this before, I think we have that power to the extent that we can have it under the law right now. And what happens is if someone is delinquent in compliance with particularly the abandoned properties ordinance, so the property is not secured or boarded as it should be, we can go to the administrative hearing officer and ask for an enforcement order that allows us to go on and do it ourselves. If we have the money, which again is that core piece, then we can send people out and that are municipal employees to do that, or contractors to do that boarding ourselves, and then we can attach a lien to the property to eventually recover that amount when the property is sold or if we eventually foreclose. We do not generally fence, I believe, because the expense of fencing is larger. It's considerably more significant than simply boarding and securing. And we always have the opportunity to remove trespassers. The police do. Or clearly, we've talked about in the past, there are some challenges where if you have a particularly wily trespasser who claims that they have an unwritten month-to-month lease with a landlord who cannot be reached, then we can end up in a situation where we have to consider whether or not we can legally evict that person. But absent that level of strategery by a potential trespasser, we do have the ability to remove. The police can remove trespassers from.
Okay, yeah, you and I have had this conversation, but so that's right. We, I mean, I know she's right legally, but just in terms of impact and doing, Jack, we have the right to board up through your own decision, or you have to go to a hearing officer and request the permission to board it up.
It's in, I believe we're covered already in the
Jack,
vacant abandoned buildings.
Step forward and speak louder.
Say your name.
Okay, Jack Frost, Chief Code Enforcement. We have the ability to board it up right now under if it's abandoned and vacant. And
because you decide, or when a hearing officer tells you.
It becomes a dangerous building. It's open to casual ingress and egress. So under Title 23, we can make it safe.
On your decision or on a hearing officer decision?
On our decision.
Good.
It's already in municipal code.
And you can bill the costs or assess the cost of that to the property?
Yes.
And it's more in South Anchorage and Eagle River, I think. In my area, it's mainly boarding up, but sometimes it's vacant land. More often, like I said, in South or Eagle River, and there it's getting people who are squatting on it. There's not a building; they're just there and getting them off with all the difficulties Ms. Wynn Pearson said. But then fencing. Do you guys ever fence?
We have, not frequently, but we have. Yes.
Sometimes, okay. And this tool that she's describing gives you the money to do things. So it's not a legal authority problem, it's a practicality and funding problem.
Fencing is expensive.
The eviction problem is a legal authority problem,
Yeah.
I believe.
Okay. And we run, as she said, we run up against some, if they really did have a month-to-month lease, I really can't. So that's something that's hard to solve. Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. If there's no more questions, Ms. White-Pearson, thanks.
Okay, I can go into a little more detail. So foreclosure registry, this is a common solution across the country. 284 municipalities have adopted this type of strategy since 2000. If you look at this, is a kind of a summary from the Vacant Property Registration Ordinance database of the types of vacant property registration ordinances enacted in the last 19 years. And we sort of follow, our ordinance right now falls into the first category. We have an ordinance that's triggered by vacancy or abandonment. If you vacate or abandon a property, you're supposed to register it, you're supposed to secure it, you're supposed to sign it, and pay a fee every year. What we're proposing here essentially moves our ordinance from that category into the hybrid category, the 1-2 down, which says basically that the requirements are triggered either by vacancy or abandonment or by foreclosure. That if you're foreclosing as a bank, then you have to come in and again, the bank is required to notify the municipality affirmatively that they have taken steps toward foreclosure. They have to provide direct local contact information for somebody who we can call if there's a problem with the property. And then it also makes them, the language makes clear that banks will be treated as an owner of the property for the pendency of the foreclosure proceedings for the purpose of code obligations, enforcement actions, and penalties, which means that when the property is not signed and secured appropriately, we can call the local bank representative and make clear that they need to sign and secure it, and if they don't, then we can also levy fines against the bank.
Because essentially on foreclosure, they are asserting ownership rights.
They are, but technically they don't have them until the legal process is complete. So the problem is this limbo period when they've initiated proceedings, but they have not yet foreclosed, and there's a relatively long period in between often.
And these foreclosure registries have been tested, like courts have said, yeah, that's legal to
Yes, this has been, again, very common across the country. To the extent that I understand from Robin that sometimes banks call her department and say, do you have a foreclosure registry? We're foreclosing, we want to register.
Cool.
And and we say, no, we don't have that. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Training.
Vicki, when we get a foreclosure incident on there, a bank, do we then increase the cost? Because we have to maintain the registry. Do we have an increase in the cost on putting that property on the registry as foreclosed?
we have not included anything that requires payment of a fee. That's something you could consider if you wanted to add.
Work an amendment for me?
Sure, I can do an amendment that adds a fee.
On the bank?
On the bank, yeah. And that is something that is relatively common across the country. I think they're relatively low generally. And my understanding from talking with Robin when we were doing the summary of economic effect for this ordinance is that she anticipates the additional work by the department to be relatively minimal. But we could certainly build in like a $200 registration fee or something I can talk with her about how much she thinks the work is worth.
That would be fun, Vicki. I'd like an amendment on that. I don't want it to be a lot of money. I just want to create the vehicle there so in case we later have to increase it, we've got the vehicle there.
Sure.
Okay, like it. We got that going. Any other questions? Back to you. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, then the second piece, again, this designated nuisance property abatement fund. Basically, we are dedicating the revenues to addressing, mitigating, and abating nuisances on private property, and this private property nuance is specific in there because we don't want this to be like nuisances on public property. Homeless camps are a common issue as well, but the point here is to create money that goes to private property nuisances, abandoned properties, nuisance troubled properties that are privately owned. Revenues that will go in there are the annual fees paid by owners of vacant buildings and former owners of abandoned real property. So we're going to direct the revenue from that abandoned and vacant property fee into this this fund, and then also the proceeds of any foreclosure proceedings that result from these nuisance violations 15, 21, 23, and we can certainly add an amendment that makes that net proceeds to make that clear. Financial incentives for action. This is another thing that's incredibly common across the country, is to have the fees related to a vacant property registry increase exponentially from year to year. So ours right now are relatively low, and I'll pull them up in just a second.
Is this vacant property nuisance or just simply vacant?
This is vacant property. So our vacant and abandoned property ordinance currently requires the payment of an annual fee for when you register your vacant property with the municipality. The idea being this is supposed to in some way offset the cost to the municipality of your privilege of keeping a property vacant, because we acknowledge that vacant properties continue to attract expensive nuisances that are expensive to the municipality. We spend more money on these properties because we spend money sending police out to look at them. We spend money sending code enforcement officers out to look at them. Sometimes we spend money boarding them up, which we never recover. And so the idea is that when you register, you pay something each year. You pay more over time for, again, the privilege of keeping a property vacant in the municipality, which the MOA then has more responsibility to take care of. Currently, under our code, we have folks paying $100 for the first year, $200 for the second, $300 for the third, and then a per square foot cost with a minimum of $300 for the fourth and subsequent years. And we looked at jurisdictions around the country who are also dealing with persistent vacant property issues, and generally they take a more exponential approach to increases in those fees. So Paterson, New Jersey, $500 for the first year, $1,000 for the second, $3,000 for each year after that. Oakland, California starts with a tax of up to $6,000 a year for each property from the first year of vacancy. Wilmington, Delaware, $500 for the first year, annual increases up to a max of $10,500 per year. Schenectady, New York starts at $2,500, gets up to $5,500 after 5 years. And this is an approach which has received recognition as actually working and having an impact on people, because it becomes more financially painful to keep the vacant property than it does to find a way to move it into new ownership and have someone get to do something new with it. So, for instance, the Wilmington program was honored by the Harvard Kennedy School in 2007 as having achieved a 22% drop in vacant properties in the first 2 years of its existence. Again,
Okay, so an exponential growth, but it doesn't keep going. I mean, you can.
Yeah, eventually each of them usually top out at something like $5,000 and it stays there.
All right, it's either worth it or not worth it for me to have my big vacant property for $3,000 a year. Is that 5% of the assessed value?
It is in Paterson, New Jersey. They take a 5%. So what we're proposing is an increase from, again, right now we have this 100, 200, 300, and then 10 cents per building total gross floor area with a minimum of $300 approach, and we've taken that and edited it to increase slightly more rapidly. Start at 100, move to 500 for the second year, 1,000 for the third year, and then 5,000 for the fourth and subsequent years. And to be honest, that's not a scientific determination. We looked at what other municipalities are doing. This is higher than where we are right now, but not as high as some of the more aggressive jurisdictions like Oakland. So certainly this is something you could take a look at, considering whether you think this is the right approach to pricing. But our goal was to create something that increases more exponentially and then creates a disincentive to keep a long-term vacant property in the municipality.
100, 500, 1,000, 5,000.
Yes.
I have, we'll get you in line. Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
So, a couple of things. So for, Oakland, just because the example you used, and I can't speak to Wilmington, Delaware, but Oakland, you can see why they have a lot of incentive to try. They have a huge housing shortage, and you can see why people would squat on a building and wait for it to appreciate in value, and then sell it for what they might perceive as a large financial gain. I don't think we have the same incentive structure here in Anchorage, and this is. I think that I appreciate that you want to escalate it. I'm hesitant with D. I think that is a number that people. Let's go a journalist here. I can see an ADN headline. They always seem to focus on the thing that gets people riled up the most. And they're like, "City will charge you $5,000 if you leave your house if you're a snowbird or something like that." So, which is not what we're doing. But I would say two things to that. One, let's consider revising these so it's $1,000 floor. But I like the per square foot, because we're trying to get the what was the name of that hotel? We're going after the Northern Lights Inn, right? I mean, that's or Northern Lights Hotel, whatever it was called. And that ultimately is a much more concerning to us than the typical small property. But also, I think we have to, regardless of whether we change that or not, we have to be very clear as we roll this out what it means to have an abandoned or vacant property. It doesn't just mean that you're not living there at the moment, right? there's a statute, I assume there's a statutory definition for it. I know that there
Everybody's.
There is. So
Right.
152105 already does include provisions that would, again, expressly exempt someone who's a snowbird or who are property that is on the market.
Right.
Or, again, any property for which you've pulled a building permit, even if you take more than, you take up to a year to do any work on the property, all of those exemptions are already built in.
Or if you're Airbnb it.
Yeah.
Or if, right?
I believe so, yeah. There are, if there's
Okay.
something going on in the property,
And
then
then
it is
also
not deemed
crucially,
vacant.
and this is something, this is a broader policy discussion, but if it's vacant in sort of the colloquial sense of there's nothing on this land, right? I mean, raw land is not a vacant property under this, is that correct?
Yeah, this is an owner of a vacant building, if you look at it in a definition,
So we
right?
have
So,
to be clear when we're talking about with the public that we are not punishing snowbirds, we are not punishing folks who maybe have left town or are renting out their, it's a specific kind of property, and, and again, I think the 5,000 number is too high.
I think I have everyone in the queue, but I have Mr. Weddleton, Constant, Mr. France, Peterson, and Training Peterson. So, Member Weddleton. Everyone but Austin. Austin, you want in?
Gretchen, you want it?
I'm loving listening to all of
All
these.
right, you guys can stay out. Member Weddleton.
Okay, so I agree with Forrest on that. I think that 10 cents is important because 5,000 is not much if you're running lights in, but I think that's a lot for the house. And
Speak up if you would, for the
I
recording.
like the 10 cents,
Yeah.
and I think these rates are quite high. I look at Carl Castle. We all know him from bus things, but he's got one in South Anchorage, and he just doesn't have the resources. I just can't dig him for $5,000 for not. I mean, he has hopes and dreams for that house. He doesn't have the money now. That's a lot of money. Even 1,000 would be a lot more. So, and then on top of that, Suzanne mentioned we charge a property tax. I mean, they have incentive to do something, and if it's not causing a problem, why should we ding him? I don't understand why he's got that house. He can sell it for much money, tear it down. But it just sounds like it's penalizing people who don't need to be penalized.
Yeah.
and I would say a couple things. I mean, if I might respond to that. I mean, I think that there are a couple different incentives built in here. One is that we know that disproportionately abandoned properties are problems. They are and again, you're looking at something that's a long-term abandoned property here. This is not a property that someone's just left vacant for 6 months while they think about what they're doing. You're looking, when you hit that $5,000 threshold, this thing has been completely empty for at least 4 years, because it's 4 years since it's been on the registry.
Financially, it
And
shouldn't
so
happen, but it
we
does.
have a dual incentive. One is, I think, while we aren't Oakland, we also do have limited land area and a lot of interest in affordable housing and a need for redevelopment in the Anchorage Bowl. And so we have a simultaneous incentive. We have the financial issue of, what is the municipality spending for you to have this vacant property that we're sending police officers out to, and we're sending code enforcement officers out to, and we're sending people out to board up, and et cetera, we're taking care of. And then also, what is the cost to the municipality of us having land that could be sold and redeveloped? We're not in a situation where people are unwilling to buy properties in Airport Heights and properties on the hillside where they could rebuild homes or they could rebuild new businesses. And we do want to create some kind of incentive for someone to move that property, sell it to someone, build more housing. So, because that's another issue that we have across the municipality. Again, not on the same degree that Oakland has, but we are not a municipality with endless land space and a plethora of affordable housing.
I have everyone except Austin in the queue, and we have 10 minutes. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. So I find myself up in the opposite camp as Mr. Dunbar. That I think that the idea of having a fixed fee as opposed to the per square foot cost is valuable. I do agree, though, the application of this has to be really careful, and I think the title, maybe not the title, even plain language there, the owner of a vacant building or former owner of an abandoned real property doesn't presume there's a structure on it, right? And I actually know of a number of properties that are undeveloped, but
And
are
abandoned.
major problems.
Yeah.
They're real headaches. And they fit just right in this, except for the fact that this theory of there's no building there, then they shouldn't be
It's a
included.
good point. I gotta keep moving. I have 10 minutes. You wanna wrap up? or-
I just would suggest that also that there are a number of property owners in the downtown who are holding properties, waiting for them to be higher value before they sell them, holding them from being raising in value. It's catch-22.
But how do we?
Eh.
Well, I mean, we have to.
I think that's
there
a
are
different
large
ordinance.
vacant lots in other parts of the city where there are basically woods right now. And how do we prevent this from being used on those?
I think it should be tied to when there's a complaint or there's a series of problems that
And-
arise from the area.
I would say also I can get back to you. I don't have the full. I only have the excerpt that we changed here. It's included as part of the ordinance, but I can follow up with an email regarding. I think abandoned real property. There is a definition in there of when something is abandoned, and so the idea is that it does include these properties that maybe don't have a home on them or building on them, but it has to be at that point abandoned and not if you just happen to own the property. Yeah, sorry.
Ms. LaFrance?
Okay.
Thank
talking
you,
to
Mr. Chair. Much of my question has been answered, but on the exemptions that you mentioned, Ms. McPherson, would you be able to send that reference as
Sure.
well?
Yeah, I'll send out the full ordinance with some thoughts after this meeting.
The definitions. And then, because in just a few minutes, the other questions I had, when does this go into effect? Because it looks like revenue, according to the city, doesn't show up until 2021. Why aren't fines included as sources of revenue? And also under financing of nuisance abatement work, any department or division can apply for using the money. It seems like there would only be a few departments. But to Mr. Train's point about wanting to make sure those funds are dedicated for the intent, you know, that should be limited. I'll stop.
Nice.
there.
I can answer very quickly. It's designed to go into effect immediately. We can talk more about whether or not we want to have some kind of delay. Fines don't go in there because the fines actually are a significant portion of Jack's department's existing budget, so we don't want to take that away. And I apologize. What was the last question?
Multiple departments.
Why can't everybody
Oh, multiple
apply?
departments. Because we felt like it was hard to quantify. Like, for instance, the legal department might want to hire outside counsel to help with some kind of creative new type of foreclosure or, sale of judgment or something. And so our worry was about artificially limiting and then forgetting someone who might actually have some kind of something to add to this pie.
Member Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Cantor, who's got that property down off Mary Street in South Anchorage, has been getting fined $10 a day. And I was looking through here to see where the $10 a day fine comes in. How does someone go about getting fined $10 a day?
That, I think, is a Richard Jack question.
Jack's eating, Rich is going to answer.
Is it because it's not secure?
real briefly today.
Come on up so they can hear you. Yeah. Tell us who you are. We know.
Rich Fern, I'm land use enforcement officer. I'm not sure, I'm assuming the building.
I couldn't even hear you, so I bet that.
Step up further and be louder.
I'm assuming, I don't know for sure, I'm assuming the building is on the register, and he paid the $100, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think he's paid the $100.
Yeah, and I just heard about it, I had somebody from Real Estate Services come and ask me about it, and I looked it up, and I'm assuming that's what he got, probably a letter that saying that he needed to register.
He could be being fined $100 a day under, if you look at my last slide is about the current, if he's violating the vacant and abandoned properties ordinance, but
Let's not speculate.
I
You'll
don't
get the
know.
answer.
Yeah.
You guys will get the answer to Member Peterson. Member Training.
Becky, would you take a look
Do-
at Oakland Ninth Circuit?
Yeah, sure.
Since we all labor under that beast and see if it's gone up the Ninth Circuit, we would like.
sure.
Because we've applied the same things they rolled on, it's gone there. And just for the body, this is something we need to deal with for years. When Vacant was mayor, I remember going through, we actually used a wrecking bell and tear down the house off parking. Then we've had some mayors that don't want to do anything. George Wirtz and Sullivan didn't want to do anything with this, so I appreciate you guys bringing this forward. It's a problem in every district across me. Thank you, Becky.
History lesson from Member Training. Member Wimmoff.
Yeah, and I apologize for being late, so if I'm repeating something, just I'll catch you later. Obviously, I come from a district with a lot of vacant land on purpose, and also a large landowner. It's a native corporation. So I am always concerned about if vacant land is how they're going to handle it, because no one out there wants to fence their land in. And the other thing is we often have more problems with people who own their property. So when you're saying an abandoned property, if people have been coming in and going, that's not abandoned because there's people in it?
Sounds like everybody would like some more definition of what
And that
abandoned
is, and I
means.
believe that is in 152105 already, and I'll circulate that afterwards because that ordinance, when it was crafted, was again designed to address some of these. We're just tweaking little, at this point, honestly, all we're tweaking in that is the amount you pay every year to be on the registry. And I think a lot of your questions are answered by the text of the code, which has been in place since 2016, but I don't have it in front of me right now, so I will send it in a follow-up email.
Everyone's interested in that, Member Consul. Thanks. Back to the conversation about the fund. I'm wondering if, this, I know I brought up the idea of net proceeds and I still support it, but I wonder if we have a period of time, if that's feasible, in which we allow all funds generated go into the fund until it hits a certain point at which it becomes really functional. Because if it's continually drained by fees and expenses, it might never actually get to the point
Of being
where
functional.
it functions to the task it's ideally set to be.
I can think about that in greater depth and also provide some follow-up about how we could deal with that, how we anticipate covering costs.
Got it, good point. How many more slides did you have?
This is my last slide. All I was going to say is that the last pieces are that we increased common fees and fines for nuisance properties. So there's pages and pages in here of changes to Title 15 fines, which are relatively low right now. And then we also created an escalator in the we changed there's a couple offenses related to violations of the vacant and abandoned property ordinance, which just had a single fine of $100, and so we just created the same escalator that's present in a lot of our other fines there, so that if you are a repeat offender, you eventually start to pay more fines as opposed to the same $100.
But it was $100 a day, now it's $1,000 a year.
Yes, except that, well, it's $1,000 per violation, and I can defer to Rich and Jack for more on this. But my understanding is we don't actually fine someone for days when we haven't sent someone out to verify that there's still a problem on the property, and we consider a violation to be each day we send someone out and notice a problem. So effectively, $100 a day was $100 per violation. And so what we've done here is use the language that we use elsewhere in the code, which is per violation language with an escalator for second and third violations within the same calendar year. And this isn't $1,000 per year, it's $1,000 max. Like once you hit your third offense, every time we go out there, you get a $1,000 fine.
Great. Whoa, you jumped the line, but you had been waiting. Yeah. Member Quinn Davis.
I just said, is there anyone else in line? I didn't jump.
Oh, well, they were, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, just quickly, so same with the abandoned property, is there a definition of vacant? And maybe that's obvious, but what if you have someone already asked as well?
No, but I think that's again all covered by the full text of 152105, which I should have brought, and I will send to you guys after this meeting so you can take a look at it and see if there's further tweaks we want to make to that underlying ordinance to make these classifications more clear.
Member LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, this is the ordinance that I believe Mr. Constant on Tuesday had suggested the inclusive language change at the bottom of page 2, correct?
Yes.
So that's already been.
That will be changed.
Okay.
Excellent. Member Wellington?
I look at these fines, it looks like they can overlap, so one could be pretty much the same as the other, not always clear cut. So can you end up with $3,000 for each time you show up in the book if they got a trash can dumped in a window or something?
And I would say, yeah, I don't know if Rich, if you
It
want
could
but
be,
yes,
yeah.
if you have multiple violations, you could be fined for multiple things on each visit. Right? Yeah.
Anybody else? Going. Thank you. It meets a concern that all of us have had at one time or another, our constituents have had, and we've tried to do. So we will look at the definitions. We'll maybe look at your amendments that have been proposed here and propose more, but appreciate that. And Member Constant.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any members here who have identified specific properties in their district that are a nightmare right now, but there is a young reporter who's new with K2U who's seeking a location that's specific. I know the administration can't be putting that information out there, but if you know personally, it would be helpful, because I at this time have no properties on my list, which is kind of a small miracle.
We have some that we went by. I don't know if that got cleaned up. Okay, yeah, people can do that.
Out there, they've been working on properties that aren't abandoned, but they were nuisance, and they just worked off the property taxes. Boom, you're down.
We call nuisance properties redecorating in Spenard. Public comment. Do you have something to say, Mr. Haberman? Say it then.
My name is Eugene Haberman. I live in the Valley. Follow the public process. Public process done appropriately. Decision made by the common body, or like in public interest. Again, this is a very informative meeting. But how does the public get to know what you said here? yes, there's an audio tape, but the presentations I saw here, which were very valuable information and for discussion, is you should need to move these meetings over to the assembly, the regular assembly meeting room at the SEC library, and do a video audio. You're having extensive discussions this week that with closed audit, assembly audit review. Where is that on the online side? Okay, for the assembly. You had dealt with the port yesterday, and now you're dealing with this issue.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Haberman. Did you have something to say about that?
I'm going to hit the recorder and turn it off as soon as you're ready.
I'll turn